What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy BrianDaddy coming at you with another video. Today we're actually going to be discussing about dungeons in Ashes of Creation. Dungeons fall under the third pillar of player interaction. Dungeons are going to be quite vital and important to the breathing world of Ashes of Creation, where, you know, they're going to range in size and be mostly open world, where 80% of the dungeons are going to be open world and only about 20% are going to be instanced. It's going to make it where multiple groups can run a dungeon. It's going to be very interesting. There's going to be PvP. People are going to be fighting over mobs. It's going to create some strife and also some, willingness to help each other. Instance dungeons also will be present to kind of help cater to the solo and group quest lines. So those will be for, smaller kind of groups and guilds to work on. Different tiers and types of dungeon content will be more or less relevant to specific groups and class compositions. So depending on the size and the whole archetype of your entire group will kind of depend if you're able to successfully go further within certain dungeons. And dungeon difficulty does increase as well the further you go on in that dungeon. So you're going to have more mobs, you're going to have more mob mechanics, they're going to become more difficult. The terrain and the environment will change and become more difficult. There's going to be all kinds of interesting ways to up the ante when it comes to getting deeper into these. The contents in today's video include dungeon locations, dungeon scale, bosses, loot, dungeon content, dungeon difficulty, group sizes, and also leaderboards. So let's get started. Dungeon locations. Dungeons and other points of interest are located throughout the map and in between all of the 85 node locations. So they're definitely going to be spread throughout the world and not in one particular, grouping. As nodes advance and expand, they will influence nearby points of interest, such as dungeon bosses, regional bosses, and raid bosses. And multiple nodes can effectively influence larger POIs. The difficulty level and loot tables of these encounters will change based on the influence. There was also a list of notable dungeons that were included during Alpha 1 testing, those being Breaker's Penitentiary, Cerulean Grotto, Deep Heart Cove, Drythorn Gulch, Duneheim, Dunezakil Crypt, Fallow's Hold, Hungering Maw, Illwind Ruins, Mana Spring Hollow, Runes of Restless Spirits, Sporelight Caverns, the Tower of Carfin, the Underroost, Underrealm Entrance, and a volcano dungeon. As also I spoke about in the previous video, which if you didn't check that out, make sure you guys go head over to yesterday's video about naval content. There also will be underwater dungeons that are a part of that naval content. Dungeon scale. The intention is that dungeons are going to be massive in scale. Very big. And there's going to be massive caverns, open world spaces, places to suit larger and smaller commitments, where, people with just 30 minutes can participate. Dungeons are vast and have room for multiple groups. So it's not going to be like, all right, it's one hallway and only one group can fit and boom, boom, boom. My guess is there's going to be many different ways to route a dungeon, and many groups can choose the different routes and end up getting to the same point at the end. Bosses. Bosses fall into the following types with increasing levels of difficulty and loot tables, requiring greater number of players to kill. So first off, you have elites, then hunting ground bosses, mini bosses, dungeon bosses, raid bosses, regional/world bosses, and then legendary world bosses. So that's kind of your step up of difficulty, kind of determining what you should be heading to next, or depending on the group size that you have. And boss respawns will be randomized within certain windows and over variable locations. So essentially, they generally want to have not a fixed respawn time or location, because what can happen is guilds and players can end up putting that position on lockdown, and then you have a situation of, oh, this guild owns this area, they're never going to let anyone else kill this boss, it's only for them. Basically what happens when you have the variable times and spawn locations, it gives people who are more agile to being able to create a group fit into that situation. Certain bosses and creatures will have voice lines along with other audio cues while doing abilities. Some bosses and encounters will feature specific original soundtracks composed by Bear McCreary, and named mobs and bosses will usually have unique character appearances. And some of these mobs include harbingers, and I don't want to go too in depth into harbingers because they're going to be a big kind of talking point when I talk about the lore of Ashes of Creation, but essentially the harbingers are comet-like celestial bodies powered by a very strong source of magic that essentially acts as a bridge between the void and the material plane where Verra exists. Again, I'll talk more about the harbingers in another video when we go deep into the lore, but they're essentially kind of what causes the corruption and how it spreads is basically brought by them. Loot. Looting rights, also known as loot tagging, is based on a blended tag and damage done system. So the first party to obtain a tag on a mob or boss will gain approximately 5 to 10% edge over competing parties in terms of total damage done when determining the loot rights. And these numbers are going to be balanced based on testing. At the end of the fight, the party with the highest damage done, including first tagging bonus, will be granted the looting rights. So it's important that if you got the tag on a mob, you are going to need to do at least 46% of the damage to be able to ensure that you get that tag and that loot off of the boss. So you can't just go up to a mob, tag it, and then be like, haha, it's mine. Because no, then if another group kills it and did more damage, you're not going to get credit for that. And I don't know if that's going to also work towards solo mobs. I wonder if this is only applying to like world bosses and group bosses and things of that nature. Because there could be people who can also be toxic of like you're fighting a mob and they can come over and just insta-kill it, right? Maybe you had it at 30%, you had gotten 30% damage. They come over and do 70% and then steal your mob. I don't know. There's some interesting dynamic there, like they said, with balancing. We will take a look at that as well. Master Gatherers also may have the ability to spoil a boss's loot. I'll share a quote here from Stephen Sharif. If you want to be able to get those mats from a boss, they're not going to just drop for anybody. They will only drop for a Master Gatherer who is capable of extracting those resources from the creature itself. The reason why we say there's a lot of interdependencies between the crafters of the world and the raiders of the world and our PvPers of the world is because we don't want to house the capability to attain those things all within the adventuring class. We want there to be an influence necessary from the Craftsman Guild to come in and either come participate and spoil the boss and gather the goods or something along those lines. Loot tables. Loot tables of world bosses or dungeon bosses have a small RNG chance of dropping completed gear items. Monsters also drop items and crafting materials rather than gold, as well as glint. There's also a much higher chance that materials and unique recipes are dropped that can be used to craft items of equitable value. There is a small RNG chance of looting rare and legendary items or crafting materials from mobs based on their level, status, and type of mob. It also applies to harvesting resources with the gathering professions. Glint. We've discussed this before, but glint is essentially kind of your main resource of way of making gold, and you're going to be getting it off of mobs. And depending on that mob's level and rarity will determine the level of rarity glint that you receive. And you can move that glint with the caravan system via commodities and other player commodities just throughout all of that. Glint is going to be your main resource of making gold in Ashes of Creation. Dungeon content. New points of interest such as dungeons, world bosses, and corrupted areas spawns as nodes develop, and this content adapts to the node progression of the zone that it is in. Additional buildings will spawn, mobs will spawn, and the content difficulty will change. Dungeons will also be unlocked when certain nodes advance to certain stages in a zone, and larger dungeons will gain higher level content as the nearby node advances. Storyline objectives for players inside dungeons will depend on the story arc paths that are chosen as well, and drop tables in areas and dungeons will be tied into the progression of those areas. And also the location points of interest will be the same on each server, but some servers may have a limited or no access to them. Jumping mechanics. There will be occasional jumping puzzles that will be featured within the world. Some of these were shown in the Alpha 2 Tower of Carfin preview, and they were also present in the early Alpha 1 dungeon gameplay footage. And they were also present here in the Alpha 0 Dunheim dungeon footage. Dungeon difficulty. The difficulty of PvE content such as raids and dungeons will adapt based on the performance of the raid or group against the previous bosses in that encounter. So essentially, However you're doing in that dungeon will actually make the further on bosses and mobs scale and change based on how your group is doing. Higher performance in earlier phases will increase the difficulty of the subsequent phases of that encounter. And certain AI behaviors might activate based on progress within an encounter. Bosses and mobs will not auto-scale based on group size, but AI behaviors might dynamically adapt to the number of types of combatants in proximity to that encounter. There will be mobs whose level is above the player. That way, whatever the player cap is, I believe it's going to be 60. Mobs are going to be level 61, 2, and 3. That way it improves the difficulty of these late-end bosses. And also, the higher the difficulty of the boss, obviously, the better the loot tables are going to be. The more glint, the more loot, the more chance at recipes are going to be there. Scaling. Levels, stats, or skills will not be scaled to allow low-level players to participate within these high-end encounters, but they are talking about a mentor program. And with this mentor program, there will be a chance where upward-level players will be able to benefit from partying or helping lower-level players and getting them situated in the game. Certain known buildings and organizations offer quests that can be initiated by a mentor to assist new players, and rewards are offered both to the mentor and the mentee upon the completion. You could lead them through a dungeon, you can meet at pre-arranged locations, and also escort quests for NPC caravans. So that's a great thing to see, that if you decided to bring in a friend and you wanted to mentor and level him up and catch him up to speed, you could use this program and help him out, and he wouldn't have to feel left behind, immediately. So it's a pretty interesting thing that's not scaling players up to your level or you down to their level, which is good. We don't want to see that. We want the world to be difficult, and we want players to have to work to be able to get to those end game opportunities. Group sizes. Ashes of Creation is designed for solo players as well as large and small groups. Parties have up to 8 players in a single group, and raids will have 40-man groups. Content will be tailored for 40, 16, and 8-person group sizes, and arenas, the PvP activity, will be balanced for 1-man, 3-man, and 5-man, with the possibility of a 20-man kind of free-for-all deathmatch style. And castle sieges are expected to have a minimum of 250 players to 250 players on a battlefield, so you can expect those to be massive, and they're also trying to increase that to even larger over time as they figure out the engineering behind getting that many players in an area. Let's talk about Zergs. This is obviously a very important topic, and Zergs are the main concern for a lot of players, right? And they're basically empowered by fast travel, and meaningful travel times that are in Ashes of Creation are intended to prevent the Zerg play from being so much of an influence. So that's why it's so hard to teleport around the world. You're going to have to move about the world in a very old school kind of fashion. Encounters are designed to have meaning in terms of how boss skills and abilities relate to group compositions, tactics and strategy, and there are different ways to make a fight more difficult for larger sized groups without relying solely on stat buffs or making the boss a damage sponge. So, rated dungeon bosses have specific mechanics and abilities that players need to learn and react to, and Zergs that are not aware of these mechanics or react to them appropriately will get wiped pretty quickly. There may be environmental hazards or AoE effects that cause more damage based on the number of players that are present in that as well. And there's a give and take for guilds that want to see a larger number of members as opposed to a more focused group that may be part of an alliance. Steven Sharif realizes that they're very cognizant of the fact that they don't want to see a bunch of Zerg guilds running around trying to just steamroll over content. And they're designing these specific mechanics and systems so that it can't just be overrun by these large guilds. Mechanics that encourage political intrigue will play a role in destabilizing these Zergs as well, and objective-based gameplay helps to balance that Zerg mentality, which is what they're also allowing during sieges of small groups, being able to have sort of like small battles within the giant war that will help the effect of the giant war in a pretty substantial way. Leaderboards. Players will also be able to opt in to track certain achievements on leaderboards such as dungeons completed, raids completed, PvP kills, caravans raided, and gathering activity. And leaderboards may also be seasonal. Alrighty, we've discussed everything about the kind of dungeon content in Ashes. It's going to be very interesting. They're going to try and do their best to prevent Zerging activity and all kinds of ways of people kind of gaming the system. So I'm looking forward to how they handle that. All right, guys, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.